So as the title suggests, this movie's all about a dog's call to the wild and finding his place in nature. If this guy ever received the call to the wild, would totally run in the opposite direction. The Call of the Wild focuses on the adventures of a St. Bernard dog named Buck, who was stolen from his home in California and sold to a bunch of freight haulers in the Yukon during the gold rush of the 1800s. There, he goes on many adventures, passing through multiple owners before crossing paths with a man named John Thornton, played by Harrison Ford. And the two go on an adventure out in the wild and exploring nature, which allows Buck to help figure out what his place in the world is. This is an adaptation of the 1903 novel of the same name, which I found out is way more popular than I realized. Some consider it a classic in American literature, and this is news to me, to be honest. This is also the fifth adaptation of that novel, although it draws a lot of its inspiration from the 1938 adaptation starring Clark Gable. This is also directed by Chris Sanders, making his live-action debut. Sanders is mainly known for animation, having written the screenplay for Mulan, as well as having co-written and co-directed Lilo and Stitch and the first How to Train Your Dragon. So he has quite an impressive filmography under his belt. And despite some cheesy-looking trailers, my hopes for this one remained relatively high. Because if there's one thing all those other movies have in common, it's the fact that Sanders can bring out a lot of complex emotions and still have this appeal to both children and adults. And while I did see some of that magic translated to his live-action debut, unfortunately this didn't land quite as well as it should have. So, let's discuss. I'd say the performances were some of the stronger aspects of this movie. Harrison Ford is enjoyable as the closest thing we get to a human lead. Despite the way this movie advertises him, he really doesn't play a major role until the second half, although he does appear sporadically through the first half of this movie. But he was solid here. He sticks to pretty much the same formula that he's had since the 90s, which is gruff old man exterior but soft interior, and he was charismatic enough. Omar Sy plays a big part in the first half as one of the first people who takes ownership of Buck. I found him to be the most likable of Buck's owners, even more so than Harrison Ford, arguably. A lot of the scenes where he's involved have this very uplifting, positive vibe to it that I really enjoyed. The first half with Omar Sy focuses on Buck as this messenger dog and having him go through extreme conditions, such as one scene where they have to brave through an avalanche. I think these were the most exciting moments, and the score plays a big part in these scenes as well. John Powell, who did the score for all three How to Train Your Dragon movies, also did the score for this. There were a lot of these larger-than-life tracks that complemented the action, as well as bringing out the tension in some of these messenger scenes, especially when these dogs would just interact with one another. I especially liked whenever it was just the animals. I found these moments to be pretty strong. One of my favorite scenes was when the original leader of the messenger pack begins to fight for power with Buck when he sees his potential as a leader and begins to feel threatened. And this dog is clearly antagonistic, but the way Sanders directs the scene, bringing out emotion through both body language and facial expressions, you find yourself kind of feeling bad for this other dog, although you're not totally taking its side. That being said, let's hold on to that thought for just one moment. The one thing I can respect about movies centered around the friendship between a human and a dog, it's that no matter how the rest of the movie is, even if it's terrible, the interactions between the dog and the human feel sincere because they use real dogs. So anyone who likes animals, pet owners especially, can relate to this. This movie, however, if you haven't seen any of the trailers or haven't read any online discussion, uses all CGI animals, including Buck. And they're very obviously fake CGI animals. And this is on top of the fact that some of this movie was not filmed on location. So some, not all, but some of those grand landscapes that you see in the movie are also digitally created. So whenever you see these scenes of just dogs together in this animated background, it's great. It all blends together. But whenever you have the one human in the otherwise digital background, or you have the one CGI dog in the otherwise live action setting, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's really bad, and it's distracting. For Chris Sanders' first live-action movie, this is still very obviously animated. A live actor was used to stand in for Buck, and it's very obvious he doesn't have the same height and width as a dog. There are these scenes where someone goes to hug Buck, and it's very obvious they're not hugging a real dog. And because of that, you lose all that sincerity you would have gotten had it been a real dog and human interaction. It just doesn't feel real. Staying on that subject of the CGI, these dogs are given facial expressions and body language that mostly resembles humans. Whenever a dog is happy, it smiles very obviously like a human. There's another scene, for example, where another dog is walking away, moping and dejected, and it looks very similar to how a human would hang their head if they're walking away in shame. And if I was watching a strictly animated movie, it would be great. It works. But it's like the reverse problem of the Lion King remake. That movie tried giving us talking animals that looked realistic, but they were so realistic that they had no facial expressions and therefore no emotion. This movie goes for the emotion by giving obvious CGI dogs human-like facial expressions in a live-action setting, and it doesn't look realistic. And you might say I'm harping on this, but this is like the most essential element of this movie. So yeah, it's a really big deal. Moving on, there's also the ongoing narration by Harrison Ford that I found just as distracting as the CGI animals, mainly because it's used in every waking moment there isn't any dialogue, and it's used to give very detailed descriptions of what's going on inside these dogs' heads, mainly Buck's. It feels like this ridiculous psychoanalysis sometimes. Like there's a scene where Buck is trapped and the narration is telling us how Buck knows what kind of odds he has of escaping, and it ends with, he knew he had no chance. And I'm like, what? It's ridiculous. And by the way, he's narrating these scenes when his character isn't even present, and they don't really do anything to try justifying that. Dan Stevens plays the closest thing we get to a main antagonist, with Karen Gillan as his wife. And I actually enjoyed them, but they are both so cartoonishly over the top that it's hilarious. Think Snidely Whiplash or Dick Dastardly, like this mustache-twirling villain, and they even do an evil laugh that made me feel like I was watching Dr. Evil multiple times. Like, they legit just go, "Mwah!" And as far as actual characterization, they're both terrible, but I at least enjoyed watching just how insane they would be. I'd also say the second half of the movie is where it gets really weak. Like I said, Harrison Ford is fine, but the scenes involving him, not a whole lot happens. All his scenes are in the second half are just him and Buck walking around hills, or they're in this boat going down a river, and every so often he'll give this pseudo-philosophical comment about life and Buck's place in the world. But that's it. It's like the movie got to the hour point, didn't know where to go, and just needed to kill an extra 20 minutes to get to the ending. So we just get Harrison Ford and the CGI dog going on nature walks. I felt like I was watching the Discovery Channel after a while. So let's talk about that ending. The last 10 minutes or so come out of nowhere. They go for this big, dramatic, climactic ending, and it really just does not feel earned. There are a few plot points from early on in the movie that it dropped halfway through and you kind of forget about them, and then all of a sudden they come back for these last 10 minutes, and you're suddenly supposed to care, but at the same time, the movie wraps things up just as quickly as it brought up all these elements again. So it just feels not only rushed, but lazy. It felt like the result of a movie that peaked dramatically at the hour point and just didn't know what to do from there. And yeah, like I mentioned, this was based on a novel, but still. I know Chris Sanders didn't write this like he did his other movies, but I'm sure if he did, this probably would have been a lot stronger. There are certainly moments where you can tell it's trying and it's very well intentioned. Chris Sanders' direction does bring out some solid emotional moments, and I do like the uplifting tone and the great performances. It makes for an entertaining, if flawed, first half. However, the very jarring CGI and the overuse of narration is extremely distracting. And this movie still would have been watchable with those issues aside had it not been for an aimless second half and an ending that just seemed rushed rather than emotionally satisfying. There might be enough here that I can see kids enjoying this, like really young kids enjoying this, but beyond that, this is kind of a disappointment. The Call of the Wild gets a 5 out of 10. Given the cast and crew that were involved in this one, this could have had a lot more potential, and there were times where it was great. I was really invested in certain moments. But I think this would have benefited if Chris Sanders also wrote the movie, given how great he's been at storytelling. You know, that and using real dogs too. But let me know, did you see Call of the Wild, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Was the CGI too distracting for you, or did you not mind it? Did you enjoy the story, and what's your favorite dog-centric movie? Did you find this better or worse than most? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you like what you see, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.